You did not become highly empathetic because you were born with a rare gift. Your exceptional emotional intelligence is not a unique personality quirk. It is a hyper-vigilant biological survival strategy. Your developing nervous system was forced into a corner early on. It detected a chronic, ambient, psychological threat in your childhood environment. You were surrounded by highly dysregulated, unpredictable adults. Your brain calculated the physical and emotional danger of their instability. It made a brutal, unconscious choice to guarantee your survival. You did not simply choose to be a good child. You biologically amputated your own authenticity. You severed your own emotional needs to stabilize the volatile adults around you. Your exceptional maturity was forged in a state of constant, silent terror. Watch closely how this pathology plays out in real time. A 7-year-old child runs into the kitchen. Their heart rate is elevated with pure, unregulated excitement. They are holding a drawing they just finished. They observe their mother standing perfectly still at the sink. The mother's jaw is tightly clenched. Her shoulders are raised and completely rigid. Her breathing is shallow, sharp, and rapid. The child instantly drops the drawing onto a nearby chair. Their own heart rate forcefully decelerates within seconds. Their facial expression entirely neutralizes. They quietly step forward and begin washing the dishes beside her. No one asked them to do this. The child carefully monitors the mother's respiratory rate. They wait silently for her exhalations to finally lengthen. They completely suppress the physiological excitement they felt just 30 seconds prior. But here is the brutal physical reality. Why does a developing human brain willingly initiate this sequence? Why does it force the active suppression of its own autonomic signaling? It does this entirely to regulate the internal emotional state of a fully grown adult. A child will instinctively trade their internal authenticity for external attachment. They use emotional mirroring as a biological mechanism to guarantee their physical survival. This is never a conscious choice. The child's autonomic nervous system continuously scans the environment for safety or danger. This relentless background process is called neuroception. When a caregiver is depressed, narcissistic, or emotionally volatile, the child's brain does not register a simple bad mood. It registers this volatility as a lethal threat to survival. This immediate threat perception triggers the hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal axis. It initiates a violent endocrine cascade, ACTH, cortisol. A toxic flood of stress hormones saturates the child's developing brain. To halt this agonizing chemical flood, the child must pacify the threat. They forcibly alter their own behavior to regulate the caregiver. The actual fatal mechanism is the reversal of the mirror neuron system. In healthy neurological development, the caregiver's mirror neurons reflect the child's emotional states. This allows the child to build a stable neural map of their own identity. But in this pathology, the entire dynamic is inverted. The child is forced to dedicate their own mirror neuron network entirely to the adult. They obsessively decode the micro-expressions, vocal shifts, and muscular tension of their parents. They prioritize external threat prediction over internal identity formation. Evolutionary psychology dictates a harsh physical rule. A child must view their caregiver as competent to feel safe in a dangerous world. To resolve the massive cognitive dissonance of an unstable caregiver, the child's brain performs a desperate maneuver. It internalizes the adult's dysfunction as a personal biological inadequacy. The child automatically convinces themselves that they are simply not quiet enough or perfect enough. This delusion preserves the necessary illusion of a safe universe controlled by a competent adult. Watch closely how they react in a confined physical space. During a tense car ride, the father grips the steering wheel. He squeezes the leather until his knuckles turn completely white. He emits a single, sharp, heavy sigh. The teenager in the passenger seat immediately stops looking out the window. They instantly shift their physical posture to directly face the father. They calculate and deliver a highly calibrated, self-deprecating joke about their own poor math grade. The teenager silently observes the father's grip loosen a fraction of an inch. A brief smirk appears on the adult's face. Meanwhile, the teenager's own stomach is severely cramped. Their palms are actively sweating. Yet, they maintain a perfectly relaxed, smiling facial posture for the remainder of the 40-minute drive. The biological cost of this performance is absolute. It causes the severe atrophy of interoceptive awareness. The physical neural pathways connecting the body's distress signals to the brain's cognitive centers actively degrade. The individual becomes physically unable to identify their own states. They lose the physiological capacity to register their own hunger, severe exhaustion, or blatant boundary violations. But the human organism cannot perpetually sustain this active neurological suppression. It cannot maintain this state without triggering a systemic biological failure. Maintaining this perfect persona is not merely a psychological habit. It requires chronic, active neurological suppression. The brain must violently silence the body's true biological impulses. This continuous suppression hollows the individual out. It creates a profound, inescapable cognitive and emotional void. The actual fatal mechanism is the tyranny of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The exceptional child weaponizes their own dlPFC. They use it as a relentless, mechanical brake against their limbic system. Any rising emotion that threatens their caretaker role is immediately targeted. Rage, grief, or simple exhaustion are hunted down neurologically. They are actively inhibited before they ever reach conscious awareness. This creates a terrifying condition of acquired alexithymia. The chronic suppression physically damages the brain's internal network. It severs the functional connectivity between two vital regions. The insular cortex, where raw physical feelings are registered, is completely isolated. It is disconnected from Broca's area, the brain's central language processor. The individual physically experiences intense physiological distress. Their heart races and their muscles tense. But they possess zero cognitive vocabulary to process it. They cannot articulate or even consciously recognize their own pain. And it gets worse. Achievement and praise become the sole mechanisms for dopamine release. But this external validation is directed entirely at the false self. The brain's reward circuitry registers a fundamental, agonizing mismatch. The dopamine spikes. It rigidly reinforces the compulsive striving behavior, but it utterly fails to deliver serotonin and oxytocin. The organism is denied the exact chemicals required for lasting psychological satiety. They achieve everything and feel absolutely nothing. Watch closely how they react in a moment of undeniable triumph. A 28-year-old professional receives a highly coveted promotion. They smile widely at the news. They firmly shake their director's hand. They express articulate, flawless gratitude. They walk out to their car, get inside, and pull the door shut. Instantly, their facial muscles collapse. They drop into a slack, completely deadpan stare. Their jaw locks tightly into place. They sit in total silence, staring blankly at the steering wheel for 15 minutes. Their phone vibrates. Their spouse texts, "How does it feel to win?" They immediately type back, "Amazing, so happy." Meanwhile, their physical face remains completely immobile. Their respiratory rate drops to a shallow, barely detectable minimum. This is the onset of severe chronic depersonalization. The individual begins to experience their own life strictly in the third person. They function entirely on procedural memory. They exist completely dissociated from any genuine emotional resonance. This inevitably leads to treatment-resistant, high-functioning depression, but the body keeps an exact ledger. Eventually, the accumulated physiological data of a lifetime of repression breaches containment. It shatters the barrier of the prefrontal cortex. This forces a devastating and uncontrollable physical crash. The body keeps an exact, unforgiving ledger. Repressed emotional data does not simply evaporate. It accumulates until the organism's allostatic load shatters its biological limits. The actual fatal mechanism is absolute systemic failure. Decades of chronic sympathetic nervous system activation exact a severe physical toll. The body is perpetually locked in a relentless state of fight, flight, or fawn. This continuous physiological alarm actively depletes cellular energy reserves. It triggers widespread, inescapable systemic inflammation. The immune system fundamentally dysregulates. The organism is dragged into a state of severe somatic exhaustion. And it gets worse. Unprocessed psychological distress demands a physical exit route. When the brain denies it access to explicit memory and verbal expression, the trauma reroutes. It completely bypasses all cognitive awareness. It travels directly into the autonomic nervous system. Unexpressed rage and buried grief physically mutate. They manifest as idiopathic chronic pain that no doctor can diagnose. They trigger sudden, blinding migraines. They erupt as violent, spontaneous panic attacks with absolutely no present-day trigger. Eventually, the neurological braking system fails entirely. The prefrontal cortex simply runs out of energy due to sheer exhaustion. This triggers a dangerous hyperconnectivity in the default mode network. The brain's resting state suddenly becomes a highly volatile, hostile environment. The individual is violently pulled into inescapable loops of invasive rumination. They experience generalized, free-floating terror. They output sudden, uncontrollable aggression directed at minor, unrelated stimuli. Watch closely how this physical collapse occurs in reality. A highly successful manager is known throughout their firm for absolute composure. They are working late, completely alone. At 11:30 at night, they drop a standard plastic pen onto the carpet. They stare down at the pen for exactly 3 seconds. Suddenly, their knees buckle entirely. They collapse heavily onto the office floor. Their lungs begin hyperventilating rapidly. Their chest violently heaves as they weep uncontrollably. They emit guttural, choking sounds for 45 consecutive minutes. They experience a visceral, overwhelming terror of total abandonment. Yet they are financially secure. They are physically perfectly safe. They are completely alone in a locked, quiet office building. This is total, occupational, social, and physical burnout. The individual literally loses the basic motor function required to maintain the facade. They lack the cognitive energy to perform the caretaker or achieve a role for a single second longer. But here is the brutal physical reality. This terrifying collapse is not a malfunction. It is the autonomic nervous system's final, desperate biological intervention. It is designed to forcefully initiate the death of the false self. It forces objective reality back upon the failing organism. True healing does not begin with positive affirmations. It begins with the agonizing, intentional cessation of your lifelong performance. You must purposefully trigger an acute neurochemical withdrawal state. The actual fatal mechanism of healing lies in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. You must sit perfectly still with the excruciating physical feeling of absolute uselessness. You must completely block the autonomic urge to fix a situation or perform a role. When you force this stillness, the vmPFC finally begins to generate new biological safety signals. It actively overrides the historical fear response, locked deep inside your amygdala. It physically proves to the organism that a complete lack of performance does not equal death. This process forces a brutal biological vulnerability. You must access the original childhood emotional pain while maintaining present state awareness. This dual awareness forces the brain's existing synaptic connections to become highly unstable. Those traumatized neural pathways briefly unlock. They are then physically rewritten and reconsolidated. They bind with a new, immediate somatic sense of adult physical safety. This requires the deliberate cultivation of parasympathetic vagal tone. The individual must actively train their ventral vagal complex. They must force the body to maintain physical relaxation. They must maintain this state while being directly exposed to the active displeasure or disappointment of others. Watch closely how this is executed in reality. A parent calls their adult child. The parent is crying loudly and demanding immediate emotional intervention for a self-inflicted crisis. The adult child feels a familiar, violent spike in their heart rate. They experience a crushing physical urge to immediately stand up. Their autonomic nervous system screams at them to instantly cancel their own evening plans. Instead, they remain firmly seated. They take a measured, 6-second, slow exhale. They manually force their rigidly raised shoulders to drop back down. They speak perfectly evenly into the receiver. I hear that you are upset, but I do not have the capacity to discuss this tonight. They immediately hang up the phone. They remain sitting exactly where they are. Their body begins physically trembling. They are sweating profusely. They are actively resisting an intense, burning neurological compulsion to call back and apologize. They force themselves to wait 20 full minutes. They sit completely still until their heart rate naturally decelerates back to baseline. The direct consequence of this action is irreversible. It forces the permanent dismantling of conditional, transactional relationships. This will absolutely result in a period of severe social isolation. But it establishes the only possible foundation for an autonomous, physically grounded reality. You must endure the death of the exceptional child. It is the strict biological prerequisite to allow the birth of the ordinary, authentic adult. You are not special. This is the most terrifying and liberating fact you will ever process. The ingrained belief that you must be extraordinary was never a fundamental personality trait. The absolute compulsion to be indispensable was a pediatric trauma response. Your endless accommodation of others was a pure neurological adaptation to chaos. You were physically forced to become a human utility to survive a highly dysregulated environment. The moment you officially cease being a utility to these people, the dynamic will violently shift. The external applause you have relied on for dopamine will immediately stop. You will absolutely lose long-standing relationships. Your nervous system will initially register this as a terrifying, life-threatening abandonment. But here is the brutal physical reality. This is not abandonment. It is the objective, mechanical dismantling of an exploitative dynamic. The individuals leaving your life were only ever attached to your compliance. The void left by the sudden absence of their conditional praise will feel physically agonizing. It will trigger a severe physiological panic response. But that exact, terrifying void is the only physical space where your actual life can finally begin. You must forcibly stop your biological conversion mechanism. Stop translating your own physiological pain into seamless productivity for others. Tomorrow, an individual will request something from you. This request will clearly exceed your internal biological capacity. You will look directly at them, and you will say no. You will not provide a single sentence of justification. You will not consciously soften your vocal tone to protect their nervous system. You will absolutely not apologize. Watch closely how they react. You will silently observe their immediate physical and verbal response. They may attempt to overtly punish you. They may deploy calibrated guilt to trigger your prefrontal cortex. They may abruptly withdraw their affections solely because you established a physical boundary. If they do this, you will immediately classify them. They are a literal historical repetition of your childhood trauma. You will physically turn and walk away from them. You will then sit completely alone with the severe physiological discomfort of being actively disliked. Your heart rate will predictably spike. Your palms will begin to sweat. You will sit with this physical agony until the chemical response fundamentally exhausts itself. You will wait until that external disapproval no longer dictates a single motor function in your body. This breakdown was designed to actively shatter a very specific illusion. It is the exact comforting illusion you have been utilizing to survive your entire life. If that neural pathway was permanently disrupted today, hit subscribe. We do not provide empty platitudes here. We do not offer cheap emotional validation. We strictly, mechanically dismantle the biological engine of your psychological suffering. See you in the next deep dive.